Breakfast with Tom Fox. We had a special edition a couple of weeks ago, but many people wrote to me saying that they really wanted us to have a repeat of what we had 2 weeks ago. But in the States, things are happening so fast that maybe we'll have a completely new special edition, right, Tom? But this is a webinar that Tom is generous to wake up very early because he's is it 2 hours or 3 hours now? Because you're
2 hours.
2 hours. Good. A couple of weeks ago, it was 3 hours. And Azevedo Sette is happy to do this with Charles River Associates, CRA, with my dear friend Cynthia Catlett. And we're having a very special guest today to help us moderate. But I just want to give you a little housekeeping rules here. Please have all your questions in the Q&A, or obviously you're free to use the chat. It can be in Portuguese or in English. Karina, Cynthia, and I will pick up the questions for Tom. And please introduce yourself. Tell us your name and the company you're with. We have a special room with an interpreter. Danielle is there. If you want to listen to the whole program in Portuguese, feel free to do so. Cynthia, am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so, no. I think those are our housekeeping rules.
All right. So please introduce us our special guest of today.
Our special guest today is Karina Lima from Mubadala Capital. I had the privilege of meeting Karina a couple of years ago, and since then we've worked together on a couple of projects. I'm very happy that she accepted our invitation to moderate this event today. Karina holds a bachelor's degree in business from Fundação Getúlio Vargas and has been working in compliance now for several years. Karina, we're really happy to have you here today to moderate. And with that, I pass the microphone back to Isabel.
Thank you so much. For those of you who are new to this program, there used to be sort of a parody of Charlie's Angels. Charlie's Thumb, and there are always the three angels here, Cynthia and I, and always a special guest. But without further ado, Tom, please tell us the latest.
Well, first of all, the stars of Charlie's Angels was not Charlie. It's the angels. So there you go.
No, in our case, you are the star.
So what I thought I might do today, since we just had a session literally a couple of weeks ago, is I know there were lots of questions about last time, and maybe people still have questions. So I really want to devote as much as I can to either Q&A or sort of a discussion about where things may be going. But I want to open with something that you may not be aware of, or it may be under the radar in Brazil, but it is very significant, and it's something you at least need to be aware of. And that is, in January, Trump issued an executive order designating cartels and other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. Now, you will probably be correct if you think, well, that was aimed at Mexican cartels, and it was. But the significance for people in Brazil, for companies in Brazil, and for companies literally anywhere outside the United States is the following. This executive order applies to everyone, and it applies not just to U.S. companies doing business in Mexico or other places that might have large cartels or other criminal organizations that get designated under this executive order. And when you move from a criminal organization to a foreign terrorist organization under U.S. law, it's a completely different change. And that change is significant, obviously, for the cartels, but it's equally significant for those who may be doing business with them. Now, I don't mean to suggest that anyone on this call would be doing business with a cartel knowingly. And that's the problem, and that's why I raise this to your attention. But if you are doing business in Mexico, if you're doing business in Venezuela, if you're doing business in Honduras, or any other country that has a large or somewhat well-organized criminal organization, this applies to you, and it can apply to you. And even if you're doing business in Mexico and none of your goods are going into the United States, you can be subject to this U.S. law. And the FTO, we call it the designation, it's called the FTO. So the FTO applies both to U.S. and non-U.S. companies. This changes the reach of specially designated nationals. And if you happen to be doing business, even inadvertently, you are now 100% liable for those actions. So say you're doing business in Mexico, you have a subsidiary in Mexico, your subsidiary pays something, whether you call it protection money, whether you call it facilitation payment, because the criminal organizations of the government, whatever you may call it, even if that money's not paid directly to the criminal organization, you can be held liable. And these criminal organizations, this is not 1930s Al Capone in Chicago. These are sophisticated criminal organizations who engage in money laundering, and they have shell corporations which facilitate these payments that go to the criminal organization. So you may be making what you think in Mexico is a routine payment to a vendor. Well, if you don't perform background due diligence on that vendor, it may be that vendor is connected with a cartel, and that cartel is now a foreign terrorist organization. You are now liable for this. So it's very draconian. It's very all-encompassing. The U.S. government is going to make this is their number one priority for criminal prosecutions to date under the Trump administration, is going after these cartels, and anyone who facilitates anything with a cartel, whether they're a U.S. company or not, you're going to be potentially liable on this. What this means for you as a compliance officer, the first thing you need to do is assess your risks. And by that, I mean, are you doing business either directly in a high conflict area, and let's just stick with Mexico because that was the focus of the initial order, and that's northern Mexico. Are you doing business in northern Mexico? Do you have a facility in northern Mexico? Do you have a Mexican subsidiary? Okay, you don't. Do you sell into northern Mexico? And if you do sell, what are you selling? Are you selling teddy bears? Or are you selling products that could be used to manufacture munitions or guns or other types of materials? Do you sell parts that are incorporated into automobiles that are eventually sold in the United States? Probably not uncommon for many countries to send parts to what we call maquiladora plants in northern Mexico. These were plants which were set up after NAFTA 1 was created back in the 90s. And all U.S. automobile manufacturers have maquiladora plants where they either bring parts in and incorporate them into automobiles, or actually build automobiles and ship them into the United States. So assess your risk and see if you are in a high conflict area or you're doing business in a high conflict area. Once you determine what your risk is, then you need to assess that risk. And if this is sounding familiar, I hope it does, because it's a standard risk assessment process in terms of performing as much background due diligence on the companies you're doing business with. Now, I'm not suggesting you go to Mexico, you start talking to people about cartels. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is you look at the entities that you are doing business with. Who are the owners? Who are the beneficial owners? Are there beneficial owners going back several tiers? So if this sounds like you're looking at your supply chain, that's exactly what you're doing. And try to determine if there are any risks of third parties being involved with or doing business with cartel. Enhance your controls around financial payments or petty cash. Train your employees who may be in this area, and then continually do that going forward. I think this area is going to be one of the largest expansions under the Trump administration, and I think there will be a series of designations of criminal gangs in Mexico, Central America, and Latin America who are designated as foreign terrorist organizations. You may disagree with that designation, but it really doesn't matter from the business perspective or from even the compliance perspective. Once that designation is made, they are 110% verboten, off limits. You cannot have any part of your organization touch them without a potential sanction from the U.S. government. The next step, and I don't think we've really explored this next topic on this breakfast series, perhaps as we should have, which is modern slavery and human trafficking. And I would say that Britain, the United Kingdom, probably has one of the strongest laws on that, but the United States has the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that UFLPA, or shorthand, and the UFLPA prohibits companies from purchasing goods from the Xinjiang region of China, which is where the minority Uyghur group have been held and forced to basically work in slave labor camps, largely in the apparel industry or that particular vertical, but also in other industries. So if you are doing business with that region in China and you are then shipping any of your goods that you then process to the United States, I think that's going to be the next area the U.S. government starts going after, because they do view modern slavery and human trafficking as something very serious that even the Trump administration will fight against. So that's going to be an area that you may not have had to look at that if you're a Brazilian company in the past. If you're going to do business in the United States or with the United States or ship goods to the United States, finished or unfinished products in the United States, you're going to have to show a provenance that your goods did not come from the Xinjiang region of China. And the presumption is you have to prove that. Now, some U.S. companies have gone very far down to prove this, literally into the DNA of fabrics. Patagonia, for instance, well-known U.S. clothing manufacturer, looks at the DNA of the cotton in their fabrics of their coats and other clothing. So you can go far down that, but it's something that I think will be the next step for the Trump administration. So those were really the two things I wanted to bring to your attention. I know it may seem like, Tom, I'm in Brazil. How can they get me? They'll get you. And at least be cognizant and at least look to see, are we doing business in any high conflict areas for cartels? Not high risk for bribery and corruption, but high risk for conflicts. And to the extent you can document, you do not, obviously document that. And if it turns out you're selling into Mexico or Venezuela or any other place of high conflict where criminal organizations are in control, for lack of a better term, you need to try to de-risk your business from that, because I think somebody's going to be coming and looking. So with that, I'll certainly answer questions to the extent I can about that executive order or the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but also I wanted to open it up for anything we talked about last time in terms of the U.S. suspension of FCPA investigation and enforcement.
Wow. Thank you so much, Tom. That's very important issues for us not to overlook, because I think that we're so concerned with everything else, but we obviously are following it, but your clarifications were wonderful. Again, everyone, if you have questions, please direct them to the Q&A or the chat. And with that, I will invite Karina to lead the conversation, the questions and answers.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you so much, Tom. Really interesting insights. And good morning, everyone. As Isabel mentioned, the Q&A is open, but while we wait for the questions to come, I have some of my own. So, Tom, my first question to you would be, considering the previous discussion on the last breakfast with Tom Fox about the 5-year statute of limitations, and that despite the pause in the FCPA enforcement, companies can still face a significant backlog of investigations once that period ends. And recently, in your Compliance into the Weeds podcast, you also mentioned the need for companies to be prepared to respond to what seems to be politically motivated investigations. And I will address that in the second question. But with all this in mind, it's clear that compliance officers will face even more challenges moving forward. And this answer might be similar to what you mentioned today, assessing internal risks and due diligence on third parties. But from a practical standpoint, especially when it comes to compliance capabilities for Brazilian companies, what would be the other key steps or advice you'd give to companies to ensure they have a strong framework to navigate these challenges, and considering their internal controls environment and compliance capabilities especially?
So let me just say, to start with, if anyone ever asks you to moderate, always say yes. And Karina just gave the best reason. And that is because if there are no questions, you get to ask the questions you want. And you get to keep asking them until somebody else asks a question. So I love to moderate. And frankly, I love it when I don't get questions, because then I ask the questions. And whether I say, oh, this came in or not, it's the question I want to know the answer to. So absolutely brilliant, Karina. You've obviously thought about this question, and it's something you want to know the answer to. So with that, what I would say in terms of a framework is use the same framework that we have all used works in either of the situations Karina outlined or the situations I outlined. And that framework is generally the following. Identify a risk. You don't have to identify all your risks, but identify a risk and then assess that risk. So if you want to look at the risk that I talked about in terms of cartels being designated as foreign terrorist organizations, are you doing business in Mexico? And like I said, it doesn't mean, do I have a Mexican subsidiary? It means literally, am I shipping products into Mexico? You've identified that risk. Now let's assess that risk. What am I shipping in? Who is it going to? How are they paying me? And who's it, like I said, who's it going to? Once you assess that risk, then you put in a strategy to manage that risk. You train your employees on that risk. Then you implement your solution. And then you monitor that implementation. And that's where, Karina, the internal controls come in. You monitor your internal controls in terms of the payments, in terms of the entities that you are paying to make sure they're not shell companies or others. And then you look to see if something is unusual. And I mentioned teddy bears in my opening remarks. Translate teddy bears into Portuguese.
Urso de pelúcia.
Okay.
Ursinho de pelúcia.
And I said teddy bears for a reason, because about 10 years ago, a U.S. company got into trouble because they were shipping hundreds of thousands of teddy bears to Mexico. And they shipped so many teddy bears that it caught the eye of authorities. Well, it turned out the Mexican cartels were laundering money by buying teddy bears. And so it became, it's sort of funny, but it's also shows that even the most innocent product, and frankly, I can't think of anything more innocent than a teddy bear. I'm a huge Winnie the Pooh fan. Some people, if you're shipping a huge amount of products to a place that it's not that it doesn't make sense, it's that it's unusual. And if you're a teddy bear manufacturer and you send thousands of teddy bears to one country, and then you start sending hundreds of thousands, there has to be a reason. Is there a business reason? Well, Mexico opened 500 new teddy bear stores and they needed inventory. Maybe that's a legitimate business reason. But if there's no legitimate business reason, then there must be an illegitimate business reason. So that's the focus of your internal controls, to identify an anomaly, meaning a red flag. And so if you, as the compliance officer, see we've now started shipping hundreds of thousands of teddy bears, you start to investigate, who are they going to? What currency are they paying us? Who's the salesman? Who's our counterparty? All of those questions that I said at the start of the risk management process. So that's where internal controls come in. It's the monitoring. And then you move to continuous improvement. So if you find something, you fix it, or you bring additional training to employees, or whatever the solution may be. So the process is risk identification, risk assessment, risk management strategy, training on that strategy, implementation, monitoring, and then continuous improvement. And that framework will allow you to assess any risk, whether it's the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, or FTO, and a country is now a conflict country that you have to look at, or if it's a risk of bribery and corruption, or if it's a risk that we need to see if we are purchasing products from the Xinjiang region of China. All of those are risks, and that framework allows you to manage that risk, whatever that risk might be. And I would even go farther to say you can manage any risk with that framework. So I used to live close to the Gulf of Mexico, and see where Trump made his mistake. It's not the Gulf of America, it's the Gulf of Texas. So that's the proper name, Gulf of Texas. Anyway, I used to live close to the Gulf, and so we were prone to hurricanes. Well, hurricanes are a risk. They're not a corruption risk. They're not a money laundering risk, but they're a climate risk. And are your facilities at risk? Are your facilities all on the ground floor? Are your written documents in a place that they could be damaged or washed out or blown away? Is your supply chain such that you couldn't get your products in or out of an area subject to a storm or a hurricane or a typhoon? So that same risk management process will help you get through any risk, whether it's climate risk, whether it's money laundering, whether it's cartels, whether it's anti-corruption. So it's a long-winded answer to a long question.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for your answer to this question. My next question here would be about the topic that I commented before. So in your recently published podcast, it was mentioned recent US investigations, which could be seen as politically motivated. And for example, the recent targeting of environmental companies that received grants from the previous administration. And these have required organizations to disclose records such as communications with regulatory agencies, transaction logs, and rent management policies. So my question is, if these types of investigations continue to expand, could Brazilian companies be affected? And for example, those, as you mentioned, operating in the US or partnering with American firms? And if so, what steps can these companies take to be prepared to respond to those inquiries?
Absolutely. And so here's the answer. Compliance is the key. Compliance is always the key. And then the second part of that answer is document, document, document. Whatever you do, document it. So when the Trump administration goes to these companies and says, we want to see your documentation, that is absolutely inappropriate inquiry from the government who gives money to a company. I don't care what the motivation is, because if the government is going to make you a grant, you have to justify to the government that you have followed not only the government's policies and procedures, but your own internal policies and procedures. And that's documentation. And so for companies, now, these companies may not have been used to that sort of scrutiny, but that's the sort of thing we in compliance do literally every day. We set up policies and procedures, and then we ensure that the policies and procedures implement the policies. We ensure that the procedures are followed and there's documentation. So for companies which have received grants, they have to turn over communications, they have to turn over the evidence of the monies they received, and they have to turn over the evidence of how that money was used. Was that money used in an appropriate manner to build something that was within the structure of the grant? Or was that money used to go to dinner at a nice restaurant, perhaps outside the structure of the grant? So if someone comes knocking at your door, whether it's a regulator, whether it's a stakeholder, whether it's a journalist, compliance is always the answer, because the process that we go through and that risk management process that I talked about, policies and procedures come in on your risk management strategy. So once you've identified a risk, you've assessed that risk, now you have to have a risk management strategy. Your risk management strategy is a policy about it, and then you implement that policy with a procedure, and then you train on it, and then you monitor to make sure your employees follow the procedures. Once again, that's where the internal controls come in. So I think the answer is the same for all of these issues. It's compliance and the key. And perhaps my favorite quote along these lines of all time was way back in 2015 when we had the Volkswagen emission testing scandal in Germany. The head of the German manufacturers union said in a quote, they asked him about Volkswagen, and he said the following: compliance is the key. And that was a German who said that. Whatever you may or may not think of the way Germans do business, he was absolutely right. And so I've used that quote since literally for 10 years now, and that's the answer. It's compliance. Comply with the law, but within the framework, that risk management framework, and will allow you to withstand any investigation from any regulator, from any government, from any stakeholder, from any third party, literally from any journalist. So that's why I'm so passionate and try to talk about compliance in the way I do.
Thank you, Tom. Isabel, I saw that you raised your hand. You have a question.
I did, but I saw that Bruna Nagashi has a question, so she's got the priority. I will ask the question after her. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me read here the question we received from Bruna Nagashi. So what impacts have the sanctions imposed by the Trump administrator on Mexican companies suspected of cartel involvement had on the supply chain of imported medicines and medical supplies? And how can healthcare companies adapt to maintain operational stability and regulatory compliance?
So there has not been a reported impact as yet on the vertical that she mentioned or the pharmaceutical supply chain. What the U.S. government has focused on in sort of the last 2 months has been the designation as an FTO or foreign terrorist organization allows them to prosecute the individuals at a different level than if they were a cartel or criminal organization. The Mexican government has cooperated with the U.S. government on this, and so far, there have been extradition of Mexican nationals to the United States that we didn't see before. So we don't have any evidence of that yet. So nothing that I'm aware of that I can report to you. But the answer, once again, is it is your compliance process. So if you are a Brazilian pharmaceutical company and you are supplying in products into Mexico for manufacture or distribution into the United States, you need to now make sure that the parties you're doing business with, number one, are not connected in any way to a cartel. But also you need to really scrutinize the books and records of your Mexican subsidiary, because what may look like a routine payment may actually be some type of protection payment. Because prior to this designation, I was asked this question, not a lot, but often enough that it stuck with me. And the question was along the lines of the following: Tom, I've got a truck in Mexico and they've been pulled over on the corner with people with guns. Can we pay them? I'm like, are the people with guns from the government? Answer, no. Yes, you can pay them because that's not an FCPA violation because it's not a payment to the government. But that's changed with this designation. So what you may have been paying on a routine basis for something, or your subsidiary has been paying routinely before, now that's a potentially illegal act by your company.
Right. I think I'm going to follow up with my question then, because when you mentioned the FTO, Tom, and you were talking about you were emphasizing the importance of the background check of your whole supply chain. For a second, I had a feeling that maybe the liability that you will have by dealing with people that unknowingly to your company are involved in cartels. Did I sense correctly that maybe there's going to be a bit of strict liability different from the FCPA? Or
It's not a bit. It's full strict liability.
oh gosh,
So
right.
if you have made a payment that works its way to a cartel, you will be held strictly liable, period. Doesn't matter whether you knew it or didn't know it. Doesn't matter whether they hid it from you. Strict liability under the FTO designation. And that's the change that I'm trying to emphasize to both U.S. and non-U.S. companies.
Right, of course, because definitely the way many of our clients perform background checks and due diligence, taking into consideration the FCPA, is probably has to be enhanced, has to be improved, has to be more profound, correct?
Yes to all the above.
Oh, thank you so much.
And Isabel, I think Brazil's an interesting position, and I don't think Tom will know the answer to this, but I think it'll be interesting for us to observe the PCC and the Comando Vermelho and how involved they are in some of the sectors here in Brazil, and how that may really implicate us if these institutions, if these criminal organizations are classified or considered cartels.
Because they're all intertwined here, right?
Yes. And in some sectors in Brazil, and that's not the point of this webinar, but I think some sectors could not operate without collaborating with these criminal organizations. So just food
What
for
do you
thought.
say? Thank you, but what do you say to that, Tom? It's just like it's the same thing that if you're stopped, your truck's stopped and people come with guns, what do you do? It's the same thing, you know, some of the business has to sort of live with the cartels. How does it work?
Well, there was a very massive case in Syria with a company called Lafarge Cement Company. And Lafarge had literally a cement plant in Syria, and they paid protection money to ISIS. And they did exactly that. And they paid a huge fine. And the individuals who authorized those payments, both in Syria and in France, all went to jail.
Really?
So,
That doesn't fall into facilitation payments?
no. It was facilitation payments do not exist for foreign terrorist organizations. And even ISIS was an FTO back when this happened.
Okay.
So there's no facilitation payments. And maybe that's the difference that you need to emphasize. Zero facilitation payments when someone's designated as a foreign terrorist organization.
Wow. That's that. I know we're not talking about the pause of the FCPA enforcement, but perhaps Trump is very busy with other ideas, right? And that's a very serious one. Thank you. I'm taking notes here. The cement company in Syria is Lafarge.
Yes.
Okay, Karina, back to you. Sorry.
Thank you, Isabel. So I would like to shift gears a bit and move on to a question that's more focused on the reality here in Brazil, as Cynthia commented about the PCC. So there was a recent case here in Brazil where a police officer who owned a fintech company was arrested for allegedly using it to launder money for the First Capital Command, the PCC. And the PCC is one of the largest and most powerful criminal organizations in the country. They are involved in a wide range of illegal activities, including drug trafficking and money laundering. And they have a significant influence over both prisons and criminal enterprises across Brazil. And this case highlights serious regulatory gaps in Brazil's fintech sector, and where financial platforms, they are not required to report transactions to the authorities like traditional banks do. So I would like to ask you, how is this risk addressed in the US? Or do you also have loopholes like this? And how do you believe companies and governments should work to tackle this issue?
Thank you for that question, because it's a part of my presentation that I forgot to make. And it's the following. In addition to this FTO designation, the United States government said that anyone that has money transfer business along the Texas-Mexico border, and they actually name the counties across from Texas to California, have to report any transaction over $200. So if you are watching this video and you saw Karina's face turn, she went, $200? That's not much money. That is very little money. And so that's the way the US, and this would apply, this is not applicable to banks because banks already had this obligation, but it's anyone who would transfer money literally from the United States to Mexico or across the border. So that is what the U.S. is doing, and it is expanding out those reporting obligations to companies that had not had them previously. Now, it's not clear from the description you gave me if this fintech company the police officer had was just kind of a regular ongoing business, not in the financial services or banking arena. But you can still launder money for criminal organizations and not be a part of financial services or banking. That's a separate offense, and the U.S. hasn't gotten to that yet. But for any company, and this is like check cashers, this is like wire transfer companies. These are little companies where typically what would happen in the United States is people would send money back to Mexico. They come to America to work, and then they would send money back home, basically. Well, it turned out that the cartels were taking advantage of this because it was under the threshold that reporting was required, and that's how the U.S. government has focused on that. But I think they're going to move to the step you detailed, Karina, and start to say that a wider variety of payments have to be reported.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. Cynthia, Isabel, don't know if you have any other questions. I like to remind everyone that the Q&A is still open, so feel free to ask questions in Portuguese or English.
I have a question, Isabel, and it was my last question in our last webinar about the SEC. I don't think much has changed, Tom, but we didn't have a lot of time for you to explain the impact of the suspension on the FCPA. The way I understand it, the SEC has independent authority to enforce the civil provisions of the FCPA. Now, I don't know if the executive order addresses enforcement of the FCPA by the SEC, or what this means, whether they would be, courageous enough to be enforcing the FCPA while it's suspended for the DOJ.
Wonderful question. That was going to be mine last, because I mentioned SEC the last time, and Tom was a little bit afraid of my question when I said that, because it does not report directly to Trump as the DOJ, correct?
Well, first, you will see no courage out of this administration or anyone who works for the Trump administration. So don't expect any courage. You're right, though. The SEC has independent jurisdiction over the FCPA. There is currently not a director of the SEC. He has to go before Congress to be approved. I'm pretty sure the person nominated will be approved, but that hasn't happened yet. So we haven't had a formal statement by the new director on the direction the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, will go. The SEC probably will follow first, and the executive order you mentioned, Isabel, does not apply to the SEC. It only applies to the Department of Justice. What I think will happen to the SEC is they will also cut back FCPA enforcement, with one exception. And the SEC is charged with protecting investors. And basically, if a company fails, either lies in their reporting 10Ks and Qs, 10Ks and 8Qs are the form numbers that they have to report on. If they lie in there, or they have a material misrepresentation, then the SEC will become involved. So I think if there's a material misrepresentation in their annual reporting or quarterly reporting, I think we could see SEC involvement, because that's a different impact. That impacts capital markets, and that's something the SEC is supposed to protect. But you'll see no courage from the SEC in terms of going against Trump. They are already trying to bring the SEC somehow under Trump, which I don't know how they can do it, because it's an independent agency created by Congress.
Correct. That's exactly what I thought. They should be independent and not report to Trump, because it's an interest of society in general, right? So,
right.
If there are no other questions, I'm just dying of curiosity, because we've been hearing here and there about the prosecutors that are not accepting the new roles, or sort of leaving the DOJ. And what's the gossip, Tom?
Well, it's not gossip, it's fact. There's a mass exodus from the Department of Justice. Lawyers are being told you have to go prosecute immigration cases now. And the one rumor I did hear was that I don't know how many lawyers there were or are in the FCPA section, 20 or 30, and they were all told that you have to move to the border and prosecute immigration cases. So the border means Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So whether they'll do that or not, that's an individual decision they have to make. The head of the FCPA unit has resigned. The head of the fraud section, which oversees the FCPA unit, he has been transferred to another position as a chief of staff of some higher level officer and within the Department of Justice. And how long he stays there, we don't know. So, yeah, everyone is being moved to immigration prosecution.
And some of them have been going to law firms, I hear, but I just wondered, why are they going to law firms if they're not going to be able to perform the same kind of work? The law firms will have no work in this area, correct?
That is a very good question, which I don't have a good answer to.
I
Well,
have,
Please,
sorry,
Karina.
Isabel, I have
No,
two new
please.
questions here from the Q&A. The first one is from Diane Nabucco, and she said, correct me if I'm wrong. It is my impression that the FCPA enforcement had already slowed significantly during the Biden administration, with fewer corporate settlements and a drop in high-profile cases. Now, with the DOJ's official pause in enforcement, some argue that not much has really changed in practice. And given this context, do you think the executive order is more symbolic than substantive?
So that's an excellent question and an excellent point that we really should sort of debate. Prosecutions and enforcement actions had slowed down under the Biden administration. I cannot give you a good reason why. Referrals to the FCPA unit, I think, were still robust. Nevertheless, the executive order itself, I think, is substantive, where I would agree with Diane's analysis is it more symbolic in the way it will be interpreted? And to that question, we don't know the answer yet, because the executive order mandated a 6-month to 12-month analysis or retrospective look back by the current DOJ to determine what the direction will be going forward. And we don't have the answer to that yet. I would expect something by the end of the year, but really until we get some firm guidance, all of our debates in this area might be more a little bit philosophical. Some of the things that could be done, they could withdraw the guidance that we've received in the form of the evaluation of corporate compliance programs and or the FCPA resource guide volumes or editions 1 and 2. There are people have speculated that companies under deferred prosecution agreements will be released from those early. Monitorships will end, but at this point, we really have no idea what the Department of Justice will do going forward.
Thank you,
But
Tom. Very helpful.
It's a great question.
Yes, thank you. I have one other question here from Pedro Conde. He's asking, Tom, if the suspension of the FCPA is eventually revoked, can companies that took advantage of the suspension be held reliable?
Yes, 110%. And that's the danger that you face. If you accept that Trump doesn't want to prosecute you and won't prosecute you, it doesn't matter in 2029 when we have a new administration, then at that point we will, you're liable under the 5-year statute of limitations. So that's the risk you run.
Tom, one more question for me. I don't see a lot of people talking about the fact that the executive order also mentioned something to the extent of more elaborate guidelines, enforcement guidelines. Wasn't there something to that effect?
I didn't quite understand the question, Cynthia. Could you
So
rephrase it?
my understanding is that the executive order mandated the development of revised enforcement guidelines. Is this something someone is working on? Who would be tasked with this? Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, we will see some revised guidelines. Who is working on it? No one knows, because there's so few people left in the FCPA unit. So there will be revised guidelines. Who is working on it? We don't know. And we'll just have to wait and see what those revisions are.
Do you know what they're concerned with? What is vague? What prompted that
What
commentary?
prompted it all was Trump doesn't like the law, and he wants U.S. companies and his companies to have the ability to engage in bribery and corruption.
Correct. Shifting gears just a little bit, is it, I understand that most of the agreements that were in effect then with monitors, for example, with monitorships, what's going on with them?
Right now, nothing is going on with them. It's speculated that the monitors will be terminated, but that's only speculation at this point. A very, very, very large money laundering case that was settled last fall with a bank called TD Bank. It's a Canadian bank that did business in America. They just had a monitor appointed. So it would seem, at least with the money laundering cases, monitors will still be used. What that means for FCPA, we're still waiting to see.
And Karine, I'm sorry, I have a question from Jean Elec, the former chief compliance officer of Petrobras, and he came in. He's having difficult time accessing the chat, but the question is there. If you can read it, please. Do you see it?
Sure, yes. So
Thank you.
he's asking to which extent the suspension of the FCPA will really bring about more competitiveness to the US, and how, though, it will be to resume the enforcement after 1 year of freedom to circumvent the FCPA good practices.
So let me take the second part first, because the law is still the law. Now, you can choose not to enforce the law, but if you break the law during this suspension period, you will have no protection, period. How this will benefit U.S. companies, I don't think this will benefit U.S. companies at all. I think it will hurt U.S. companies because my experience has been once you start paying bribes, you always have to pay bribes. Or once they have you, they have you. And it simply becomes a tax. Whether it's a one-time, you may think it's a one-time payment of $10,000, $20,000, $1 million, whatever it is, but it never stops. And so it costs you money, and typically you deliver poorer services when you pay bribes to get work in a country. But this suspension will have provide no protection to U.S. companies or other companies who engage in the executive order. Trump changed the national security focus of FCPA enforcement. Up until that time, it was thought that corruption led to crime, which led to terrorism, and that many thought, and actually there's a direct link to 9/11 to that. So that was the national security issue, which led to the explosion of FCPA growth in the first decade of this year. Now, Trump says, no, the national security interest of the United States is to do more business outside the United States in high-risk countries. And that is, whether you agree or disagree with that, that's the stated reason. I disagree with it vehemently, that it's not in the national security interest of the United States to engage in bribery and corruption to do business. So that's sort of where we are in all of that.
I think you were
You're on
on mute,
mute.
Isabel.
I'm sorry. I was going to say we only have 3 minutes left. Tom, do you want to add anything? Karina, would you like to add anything in closing?
No, I would only like to thank all of you a lot. I'm really proud to be here with such outstanding professionals, and thanks a lot for the invite, Cynthia.
You're welcome. We're so happy that you were able to join us today.
Thank you.
Right. Tom, I think we'll need more special editions because the world's upside down now. You know,
Yes.
it's like every time you wake up, you say, well, there's something new here. And obviously the developments are so important. In any case, I want to thank everyone who has attended our webinar today and remind you that our next Breakfast with Tom Fox, because it's every quarterly, we try to do it, and then we've been very successful in how many years now?
Oh, I think over
Cynthia,
3,
some-
Isabel. Yeah, I think
3 or 4, right?
Yeah.
So our next one will be in June. It will be a Wednesday, June 18th. And we'll be happy. I don't know if I can wait that long, Tom.
Well, you could poll your audience and see if they want to do this monthly.
Right. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful.
Huh?
And maybe we can have it more like a round table also, where people can participate rather than place their questions in the chat box. We'll talk about it, Tom. Thank you. That's very generous of you
It
to
is.
offer, because we know that you have to get up a lot earlier than everyone here in the program. Thank you so much.
All right, guys.
Thanks, Tom.
All right. Bye-bye.
We'll
Bye.
see you
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
if not earlier.